I'm excited to welcome and introduce our speaker today, Zina Rodriguez. Zina has over 25 years of experience in the SUD treatment space. She's a social worker, certified addiction professional, and also a certified diversity executive, and collaborates with treatment providers on the development of transformational DEI strategies that align with their mission and values. She provides organizations with tools and trainings to hardwire DEI within their organizational plans by developing sustainable, ongoing initiatives that hold them accountable for keeping systems, processes, and goals inclusive to employees, clients, and communities. She has held senior leadership positions for national and global behavioral healthcare companies, where she has served as executive director and in senior marketing and business development roles. Zina's mission is to create inviting, intentional, and inclusive healing spaces for individuals to achieve mental wellness while creating pathways for success for individuals from underrepresented communities. Zina is a board member for the National Association of Treatment Providers and a member of their DEI committee and conference planning committee. She also co-hosts Colors of Recovery, a podcast covering a range of topics related to mental health, substance abuse, and recovery within marginalized communities. Zina has served as an adjunct professor at Rutgers University School of Social Work, and she holds a MSW with a concentration in administration from Fordham University and a BSW degree from Rutgers University. She's a mom, a wife, a nana, and her favorite pastime is to sit on a beach with a good book. It is now my pleasure to introduce Zina Rodriguez.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to be with you here all. I think it's a great month to do this. It is BIPOC Mental Health Month. And, I struggle sometimes with the verbiage around that because, it's also termed as Mental Health Month, but we know marginalized folks now represent the global majority, right? But glad that we have this space and this time together. We'll talk about some of the impacts of mental health within the substance abuse and mental health arena throughout this presentation. And I'll just skip because he did such a lovely introduction there. I'll just start with saying I am truly a social worker. I think I was born in the womb, probably because of the circumstances that I was born under, that I had to advocate for life and sustainability from a very early age. I grew up in the Bronx, New York. My racial identity, I am Black. I'm a Black Latina. My father is Black American and my mother's Puerto Rican. Grew up working very poverty, then some working class. So there's a lot of intersections of my life that inform my work and really why I became a social worker, I think, right? And my value system is so aligned with the value and ethics of NSAW Code of Ethics. So I really like to start this presentation by talking about that Code of Ethics and the value system, because it's so aligned with what's going on socioculturally, politically in our country. Right. And I think particularly for behavioral healthcare professionals, we have to remember that we do take a code of ethics. And a large part of that code of ethics, especially in the time that we're in, is service and social justice. And it is everything else that it's aligned here. So it is with this lens and value system that you're going to, I present the material that I present. There are some folks that may have some opinions about it. That is perfectly fine to do so. Let's have a discourse around it, but understand that it's the framework that I work from, because it is the value system that most aligns with my profession and my personal. So with that said, I love this Angela Davis quote because I think in the times that we need it, our clients need us to really be standing by something like this. We can no longer accept some of the things that are happening for marginalized communities or haven't happened for marginalized community. And it's up to us to make the change. Those of us that are direct behavioral healthcare providers or providing any type of services to certain communities may be very well aware and entrenched of the disparities and really the crisis of the lack of equitable care. So we're going to talk a lot about this, but it is kind of my call to action for us to really take everything you learn here, everything we're going to discuss, and think about how you can apply it in whatever setting it is that you work in and within organizations. I think we're at critical times, and we'll talk more about that. So can you see us? I was really provocative. I created this presentation about, I think in response to what everyone was feeling after the George Floyd murder, and kind of really understanding that within the world that I worked in substance abuse treatment primarily, and I worked in mostly private spaces, there was a real lack of visibility for leaders from marginalized communities. There was also a lack of clients. And, growing up the way I grew up during the crack epidemic. I had 2 uncles that died of opioid overdoses in the 70s and in the 80s. I really understood from a personal place that our treatment facilities should be full of people from all communities, and communities of color were very underrepresented in the treatment settings that I worked in. Leadership within those settings was really underrepresented, and I was almost always, and still am, one of the rare people of color in holding certain leadership roles. So sometimes I had a voice and sometimes I didn't. And we'll talk a little bit about more of that. But that's really how this title was born. And it was recognizing, as we look at those images on the screen, that when I was working in residential treatment, it was rare that I had a community that looked like this, a cohort of clients, patients that had this diversity that's representative of the screen, but well knowing that there was a need for services for everyone that you see represented. So that's what came about when I first iterated and created this. And I've been iterating. Every time I do it, I iterate it. I try to include updated stats and materials for people to understand, but that was really the context, right? It's a call to action. And it's like, can you see us? Are we represented? And where do we need to be represented? So when we talk about culture, I shared a little bit about my culture, right? Just the beginnings of it, and how my culture, my value system has been informed by, I grew up in an urban environment, how I am positioned from a racial perspective, what class in that racial perspective, how economics inform that. So what we also know is that everyone, no matter your positionality, you belong to a multicultural group. If you grew up in the South, there are different cultures and beliefs and norms that may differ from the North. We also understand within this, we're not a monolith, right? There's so many intersections that make us up. So I wanted to give folks, if you wanted to share a little bit about how you identify what you believe about culture, how does culture inform, whatever it is, the work that you do. I wanted to just give an opportunity for anyone who wanted to share. And it's okay if y'all are shy or multitasking in the background. I understand that. So no takers? Okay. And so we'll just jump right into what happens when we don't say we see color. And I have a really, I love this little cartoon. It is from the Cartoon Network. It is around color, but I think it's so well encapsulates what not seeing color means. And I love that it's like from the mouths of babes almost. And some very creative adults created this for children, but I think it's very applicable to how we see it. So I'll play this and we'll come back.
Color blindness is our game because everyone's the same. Everybody join our circle. Doesn't matter if you're white or black or purple. What the? Whoa. Hold up a minute here. Ugh, who wrote this? I think it kind of does matter that I'm purple. I mean, I'm purple because I'm literally an alien.
Well, I'm not an alien, but it definitely matters to me that I'm black. Yeah, it makes a difference that I'm white. I know the two of us get treated very differently.
I just think it's messed up to compare me being an alien to you two being different races. You're both human. You're totally biologically the same. Adding purple people into a lesson about human racism makes no sense.
Yeah, that is pretty weird. I think people like the black, white, or purple thing because adding a fantasy race in there helps distract from the actual racism black people have to deal with. Right. My experience with anti-Black racism is really specific. Other people of color experience other forms of racism too, but you won't see any of that if you don't see color.
Dude, so this entire public service announcement could be a ploy to avoid talking about racism altogether. Hey, could we get a rewrite where we appreciate each other without erasing what makes each of us different?
Okay, but it's gonna add a couple hours to the shoot.
I can make it work. Open.
You were rolling just now, weren't you? Can't we just slap some graphics on this and call it a day?
So I absolutely love that, because I think about that in the context of when we're treating our clients, what's the impact of not seeing color, right? And I mean, I think they just so cutely articulate the invalidation that can happen and the ignoring of the intersections, right? So, you know, here on the screen, what does it feel like when you don't see color? It's basically a person is not seen. And I love that they discuss, you know, in a very cute way, the social construct of race. Of course, we're all one human race, but when we go beyond the layer that was invented by others for very particular reasons, why race became, and the separation and the actual colorism behind it, we understand that how people are navigating, especially in this world, is directly impacted by that racism, right? Because we did do that. But now that we did, we have to acknowledge it, because when you see me, you see me. And I'm going to be treated with whatever implicit bias you may hold about what you perceive about my race or what you think about my race. So this is just a, you know, very true thing, and something we need to acknowledge and work around, work with, understand more, understand the complexity behind it. So we are not invalidating each other. We're not invalidating each other as colleagues. We're not invalidating each other's experiences clinically. So just, you know, a crucial part of it is that people need to be seen, and the layers of that exists. So when someone says that, you know, speaker, you know, someone says that to you, there's a desire that you don't even want to understand where I come from, right? You may not even want to know more about me. You know, I don't see color. Well, you're not going to understand the complexities of me. So much more deeper when that's in the context of a clinical setting, right? And we'll talk a lot more about that. So in all, it's about being able to see, right? We want you to see color, right? But we want to see color through an anti-racist lens, where we're not discriminating, marginalizing, and trying to, everyone holds bias. We'll talk more about that. Working towards leaning into that bias and understanding what those biases are coming from and how they may be interacting with how we work within the context of our clients, within our organizations, and with each other. So why is this so important now? Why, you know, I think it's pretty obvious, you know, just turn on the media, turn on any channel, go on, scroll through any of your TikToks, whatever social media platforms you use. Race is, it is what it is right now, right? And people are feeling it in very specific ways because of a lot of things that are happening, right? From a socio-political context as well. That's why it's so hard to separate both. It is what it is right now, and it's a deliberate thing that's happening, right? So if we pay attention, we understand that. But for us in the clinical and provider world, it's really important for us to understand that, for us to be able to adequately deliver care to our clients. We can't ignore it. We can't ignore that our clients are experiencing vicarious trauma, racial trauma, by just scrolling through their social media, by just turning on the news, by just walking outside their door, by experiencing maybe differences within their neighborhood, within their family context. So we have to get comfortable with seeing this, because we are a multicultural society. We are, and I'll show you the statistic by 2044, you know, we are the global majority persons who represent, you know, marginalized communities. But in the US, by 2044, this will no longer be, you know, the statistics will shift dramatically. There's an increased demand of care. We know it. I'll show you some stats around that. And I mean, every day and whenever I get ready to do this particular workshop, I look up what stats are available with mental health and substance abuse, what's the most current thing out there, and there's so much disparity when we look at the stats. And I think there's a need for us to be able to do this more and more, to have really open, candid discussions so that we can provide culturally responsive care. It's not just for our clients and patients, but for people that we're working together in this environment. So how do we create safe environments? And that's why you heard my mission. That's a large part of my personal mission and professional mission. Because if we're not doing that, how are we creating really truly healing environments where people need to heal if we're not understanding everyone's cultural context and what their needs are, right? So not just, clients, but also staff. So this was the stat that I was referencing about 2044. And I love it. I have adult children, one of them falls under the category of Gen Z. We have some really interesting conversations of late. There are some obvious generational differences between some of our viewpoints, but I am so excited. I get excited and hopeful about the future when I hear him talk and challenge me on my own beliefs and my belief system, right? This is the generation, and I'm showing some images of, this group of Gen Z representatives that have really put mental health on the forefront, that are caring about their environment, their mental health needs, gun violence. They are the most impacted by all of these issues and will continue to be impacted. And they're the biggest voice for change right now. Thank goodness for them. So I encourage them, and I encourage the dialogue with them. But really what we're trying to strive for is, and I think I try to share with many of the organizations I work with, if you're not paying attention to these issues, if you are not really approaching cultural responsive care, and doing true belonging, diversity, and equity work within your organization, then when are you going to do it? Because it's now that it is needed, and times are changing. So a lot of our modalities, even our historical modalities as a social worker, our theories, are grounded in studies and modalities that were studied on one white homogeneous group. So we need to expand some of our learnings and modalities to be able to reach other communities. What other healing practices and historical practices do communities have? And we'll talk a little bit about that. I don't want to go off too much of a tangent, but I really believe about the empowerment of when we're working, especially in clinical spaces, of what client strengths are and what they're bringing culturally that we may not be looking at because our trainings are so focused on book learnings that we learn that we're not really built to treat different marginalized communities. But we'll talk more about that. So I alluded to the impact of culture on substance abuse and mental health and how it affects minority communities, marginalized communities specifically. And when this is outdated now. I think this is up to date as of February of 22. This is an educational website that talks about the restriction of education, racism, and bias specifically in schools, right? Why I bring that up? Because think about if you're a child from any of these communities and what this means historically, or a parent, or you hold a positionality, that the history that impacts your life is being restricted and being taught. That what you experience on a daily basis, if it's bias or any other issue, is being negated. What does that do to one's mental health? Right? So I bring this up, and this is part of kind of the social justice piece of this, is that it's so important to understand what oppression could look like for communities. And this is a form of oppression, reducing someone's history, reducing someone's experiences with bias, whether you're a person of color, whether you're a person from the LGBT community and any of the intersections that exist. This is so critical to understand. When you look at stats like this, these are real things that are happening every day in our world. And the messaging that the people that this is about is getting is there's something wrong with me, right? Same thing with, this is so now outdated. I couldn't find a more current one. I gotta find one. I think they just can't keep up with the amount of legislation that's going on these websites. But this is the from the Human Rights Campaign's website, and the number of anti-LGBTQ bills in 2021. We know that there's even more. I live in the state of Florida, where there's actually a bill that did pass legislation and has been enacted that this type of webinar that I'm actually doing is not allowed in certain settings in the state of Florida, right? So we see that. We saw the Don't Say Gay bill that passed. We see this. So I bring this up, the social political, because again, it impacts the everyday mental health of clients, colleagues, friends, those in our most inner circle. This is a direct impact on folks. And I have, you know, besides my own personal identity, I have people in my family that are from the LGBTQ community, you know, so who feel personally attacked. There's not a person in my kind of inner circle that hasn't felt some type of mental health related response to what's going on. And the good thing is, there's an upside to this. People are speaking out about it more. And even within my own family, that is very, you know, you kind of, some of them pray it away. Some of them, we don't talk about our problems out loud. There's becoming more of a breaking of that stigma and talking out. So it's something that we could capitalize, but capitalizing it also understanding the context of what folks are going through. All right, let me just check time because, and let me pause there. Let me pause just in case anyone has questions, anything came up in the chat, any feelings around this. That was some heavy stuff I kind of said, and folks may have a response to it.
Thanks, Zina. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question, or if it's easier, you can include your question in our chat.
All right. Okay. Looks like we got a quiet group. All right. That's okay. I'll keep going. And really feel free, if you do have something or something comes up, the moderators will let me know that we should pause for a second. So if you know, as I pause and you can't think of something in a moment, feel free to jot it in the chat and we'll come back to it. Okay. I really kind of want you all to also, you know, express any questions that you have around this, or, you know, any feelings that may come up. So culture affects every aspect of an individual's life. We talked about that. We're talking those stats that I showed, and we discussed a little bit about, is about breaking stigma, is about resources. And when we think about, if people are perceiving, feeling, having mental health struggles around this, how do we understand the symptoms as clinicians, especially under the context of culture? How do we garner community support for folks? What do we know about intergenerational trauma for the clinicians in the room? What do we need to know more about specific intergenerational trauma related to different communities? And definitely about racial trauma, right? And so this is kind of another image of talking about the same topic from the American Psychiatric Association. And these are the things sometimes we don't understand, the layer under the layer. How do we understand how ethnicity, culture impact how manifestation of symptoms are coming about? How people are perceiving and coping with their mental illness will be very much impacted by what their culture has said about it, what they've learned about it. So there may be some education we need to provide. And then when we talk about family and community support, we may need to find out more information about their family and community support and some traditions and things that may be within the strengths of their community that we may not be aware of with our lens. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in depth. How doctors interact. I'm going to show a video in a little while that's going to show some bias. You're going to see it from a medical perspective and the lack of equity, how bias influences how medical providers and clinicians treat clients. And hopefully we can folks will have some discussion around it. The stigma and shame for communities around reaching out. I think overall there's stigma and shame from a very global perspective. I think we're breaking down that barrier as the years go on. I think, the COVID epidemic, unfortunately, and the quarantine and the mental health issues and increase in substance abuse problems that came out about that has increased an awareness around it, and folks are talking about it more. I do some work with a consulting group that works with employer services groups, large organizations that realize this, and they have brought in teams of wellness coaches to work with their clients who now are remote working and no longer share space, and they're no longer going to the office. They're feeling more isolated. It kind of was exacerbated during the pandemic. And then of course, now folks are still remote working. And what does that mean in the context of culture too, when we talk about that, right? So this image here really kind of represents some of what I think I was referencing around what's happening in our world sociopolitically with the pandemic has affected at disproportionate rates communities of color. The George Floyd, that center photo, was kind of a catalyst, and a tipping point, I think, for many of us in the behavioral healthcare space about what we were doing. He's somebody who was struggling with substance abuse disorder for many, many years. I've had conversations with many colleagues about, that should have been one of our clients, what was missing, what happened. And then we saw the criminalization of what his murder became, right? Like, people try to criminalize and demonize someone who was a long-term substance abuse disorder, who was struggling throughout his life, right? What was the impacts? And when I think of it, I look at through a little girl's lens. I look at it as somebody who grew up with addicts. I think about his daughter and the context of what was that going to mean to her? What does that mean for the family? How do you break the cycle? How do you have conversations? How do you have support systems in place for folks from marginalized communities, instead of just looking at them as criminals, but having wraparound services for family members, for the individual treatment. We know recovery doesn't happen in a silo, right? So that really brought about, I think, for our field, really kind of a wake-up call that we're missing something. I think the pandemic, just the disparity in deaths. When we talk about frontline workers, people often forget that everyone who is delivering your Amazon packages that we were all, shopping all the orders from Uber Eats and Grubhub were primarily persons of color that were still on the front lines, exposing themselves in the height of the pandemic to getting sick, and disproportionately were affected by it. We think about the vaccines and the distrust that's built into many communities of color with the health system, and how difficult it was to convince people that the vaccines were safe, right? So all like historical stuffs that really kind of exacerbated during this time period. We saw in other marginalized communities, Asians, we have just seen an abundance rise of hate crimes. And I think when we think about the socio-political context, the two top photos where you see, that really unfortunate, it's really even hard for me to talk about and describe, when you see a noose and something that represents for Black people, one of the most egregious parts of our history. And it's juxtaposed, you see the other side where we have Black women who rallied for a right to vote, right? And who have rallied throughout history to vote for the best interests of Black communities, right? And so we have these polarities right now that are real and people are struggling with. And I think we need to be able to speak to them openly, which is why I bring them up in these type of conversations, because if we're not doing it here, trust me, then we're not going to be able to do it with our clients effectively. And our clients are feeling this. They're going through this, right? And those bottom photos, just the death, the consistent, the vicarious trauma that everyone has been experienced by watching what we have experienced. So these are just some statistics, and I try to, okay, I see a hand. I'm gonna pause. So let me pause there. Yay, a hand, Chad.
Oh yeah, I just want to just make a comment. Yeah, this is an excellent training, and especially when you mention growing up during the crack epidemic, and seeing communities transform to having 2-parent households to high incarceration rates, and seeing that trickle down to the school system, and so really a person of color coming from the inner city, definitely is one of those things like the war on drugs didn't become a war to reach the suburbs. So that effect within those communities, that still can transfer over to a certain lack of trust within the system as a whole, to say, well, you forgot about us for the last 20 years, but why should I care about it now? So excellent information. I just wanted to add that point.
Thank you, Chad. I really appreciate that. And this is why I think it's so important for folks to engage, and not that I'm guilting anyone, but what happens is you do hear the voices that need to be heard, and people's lived experiences. So Chad, I really appreciate you sharing that. I'm going to speak a lot, and you're hearing it anecdotally from my own lived experience. But it's also important for us to hear the lived experiences of others, because it is what informs how we treat and how we build treatment settings, how we create our policies and procedures, so are we looking at it through the appropriate lenses? And what, Chad and I are illustrating here is looking at it from a lens of, do you understand the clients that you serve? So if you're working with clients from an urban environment, what do we need to have? And you kind of want to have these voices like ours at the table to help inform that. So I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing.
Zina,
and yeah,
we also have a comment in the chat from Ashley about how unhelpful it can be as a member of a marginalized community to hear, like, well, at least it's better than it was 50 years ago.
Yeah, I want, I'm gonna say, for me, I don't know if it's better anymore. I think we've rolled back a little bit. I think, we look at the Dobbs decision, right? That was 50 years of precedent that was set that just got pulled away. My granddaughter and other, folks who would be directly impacted by a right that I had will no longer have that right. So you think about, are we better right now? I don't know, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful as we continue to engage in settings like this with folks from that represent all cultures and communities, that it is the only way that we're going to be able to move forward. We're at a tipping point. There's a really great Netflix series. I'm forgetting the name. It's not a series. It's it's an attorney. His name is Jeffries, and he did a town hall, and he talks about we're at a tipping point. And he's an attorney that grew up during the civil rights period, or remembers his parents during the civil rights period. And forgetting what, I think he grew up in Tennessee. But he speaks a lot to the fact that we're at this tipping point again, and how are we going to move forward? So yeah, to that statement, that's what I believe. I think we're just at a tipping point, which is why this is so important. And looking at statistics, I think, are very important. When we're organizations and we're planning and we're strategizing, we make our decisions based on data. The data there's so much data available that really breaks down the disparity in treatment. And when you look at this, says the crisis. When you look at some of these stats, that's crisis level stats. Are we treating it as a crisis? And to Chad's point, during the crack epidemic, we didn't treat that as a crisis. I can tell you, I walked down my street and crack was openly sold. There was definitely criminalization, but there was no treatment option. And I think when you look at the suburbs and the opioid epidemic and the outbreak there, when it started to hit, then there was a response, and there was a response to decriminalize. So we have to be real about that and talk about that, and talk about the impact, and talk about the why. Like when I look at the Asians, the one stat from Minority Health, the HHS, that says Asians were 60% less likely to have received mental health treatment. What's that about? Why is that number so big? And there may be a big cultural context piece to that, of how Asians perceive, and Asians aren't a monolith, hundreds, but their perception around mental health care. So what do we need to do as those providers for those communities? What are the stakeholders within those communities that we need to engage with if part of this is a big just stigma on mental health treatment? So those, that's the call to action for us when we see these stats. We need to respond to that. The indigenous community, 1 in 8 Native Americans are in need of substance abuse facility. That's a pretty old stat. There's SAMHSA's come out with its 2020 stats recently. And this one really I looked at the Trevor Project's website and their most recent survey of 34,000 youth. This response was just to those who attempted suicide. And when you see these numbers, this is, I wanted to cry when I saw them. When I look at 26%, that last one of Black, transgender, non-binary, had an attempt to suicide. 59% are seriously considering it. Go back to the chart that talked about the anti-LGBTQ laws. Go back to the chart that I showed, the graph that I showed on the bills. Who wouldn't feel, right? These are the children. These are our most vulnerable. Like, they are so not seen, not cared for. Nobody cares. And they actually hate me. They hate me. And so these stats is something we really need to respond to. So this leads me into, we talk about cultural humility. And in our worlds, a lot of us, our vernacular really was built around cultural competency. I don't think we ever have cultural competency. That's why I have it as an asterisk. I think we're always on a continuum. We're on a journey in learning. And I think the most critical thing is that we combine humility with trying to achieve competence, meaning we're always learning. We're doing webinars like this. We're getting books and reading and meeting with individuals and engaging with stakeholders so that we can then respond from a cultural appropriate lens that is specific to the people that we are treating, right? Because what we know in this particular stat, that 50% of racially and ethnically diverse clients end treatment after one visit, is from the SAMHSA Cultural Competency book. It's quite dated, that statistic, but I'm sure that number is about right and probably increased. Just to give you, let me just check for time. Okay, we're getting close. I'm going to keep going. So what we know clinically, right, in our demographics of who actually delivers services, I think that's important for us to know and understand. And I put this statistic up not to say white folks shouldn't be doing treatment, right, for marginalized communities. What has to happen is there has to be a deep learning about what are the needs for culturally responsive treatment for different communities, because whites do hold the majority position. I think that will shift over the next decade as many more youth are getting involved and understanding, and as we as organizations create pipelines for education for marginalized folks, so that shifts. But in the meantime, there's a responsibility for that 74% to be able to learn and engage, find the tools that you need to get in touch with stakeholders in your community, learn about the communities that you need to teach. It is kind of what needs to happen in this meantime. We can't we can't go blinded. We can't go with what we've historically known. Because at the end, we need to build a relationship with our clients. We talk about the therapeutic alliance often when we're a training clinician. How do you form a therapeutic alliance? Just like any relationship, it's getting to know each other, getting to know kind of the nuances about anyone in any context of relationship, but especially more if you're a white clinician and you are treating a marginalized client. Do your homework, find out more. Be able to be uncomfortable with asking questions sometimes. And I'll share a quick anecdotal story. I've been in therapy probably on and off for 20 years. All of my therapists were white, up until 3 years ago, when I was really intentional about finding somebody that was more representative to me. And my real reason for doing that, I felt uncomfortable having topics around race with my white clinician. I was worried about her comfort level about the things that I wanted to open and share about. So that's something to really understand. And I had great clinicians, and you know, my last clinician, she was a wonderful, wonderful clinician, but there was something there from her lack of understanding by a few things that I had shared about some of my cultural and identity struggles that she didn't, I saw the discomfort. And it was like, okay, I can't have this conversation here. So I think about that when you're a clinician, and think about how, when a client may be expressing or not expressing and needs to express, how do you approach them? So the other piece of this is understanding the impact on the therapeutic relationship, is understanding your power and privilege within that setting. And I don't know how many of you all are familiar with the power and privilege wheel. I've also put up the intersectionality wheel, which is based on the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, because I think that is such a critical piece of what I was just referencing. I hold positionality of power and privilege in some settings, right? And I need to understand that. Where we sit in proximity to this circle is critical in our own understanding, so that we can understand that when we're with a client. And I'm going to show a video in a little bit that's going to play that out. Understand your implicit biases. Understand, have any of you done, and we've got a big group here, so I won't ask everyone to answer the question, but have you done a Harvard Implicit Bias Association test? You could do a bevy of them. There's different categories that you can do. I did it, and it was shocking to me on some of what the biases that, as this, you know, social work, social justice person, some of the biases I still held. So I had to really dig deep into that and do some of my own work around that. What did that mean? And why was I feeling that way towards different groups, even within my own in-group, right? That's a very true thing that happens. So understand your bias is a big part. And we'll talk a little bit about that after I show this video. Knowing what microaggressions and macroaggressions are. And I got to tell you, I'm seeing this overly used sometimes, and I'm seeing it used sometimes by different communities against communities without a real forethought into what it means. So I think it's really understanding what micro and macroaggressions, and we'll see it played out in the video that I'm going to show. It's knowing not just macro and microaggressions, but what's overt and covert racism, what's systemic, and then what is really true racism. And I'm going to share all these slides with you all. So I just want to go through them so we have time to watch this video and discuss.
Good morning. How are you?
Cool.
So, can we talk about how you got here?
You think I got a funny looking face? I just thought it was funny.
Hey kids, I'm telling you, go right here.
Man, we ain't doing nothing.
Go right here before I'm called cops.
So, you didn't do anything?
Nope.
Then what's all this?
Depends on who's reading it, I guess.
Well, looks broken. Skateboarding, huh?
Yes.
Is this the first time you've hurt yourself?
No, I get hurt all the time.
At home?
At home? He hurt himself skateboarding at the park.
Okay, ma'am. I'm gonna have a counselor come in and speak with you.
A counselor? For what? He's okay.
Boy, I done told you them tricks were gonna put you in the hospital.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, too. A nurse will be in a few minutes to help you check out.
What's up?
That doctor thought I did this to him.
How you doing?
Hi.
It ain't fair. Fair has nothing to do with this. This is about you taking responsibility for your actions. Look, I know so many young men just like you that didn't do anything. And yet, most of them are in prison.
You don't know me. I ain't going to no prison.
If you don't want to end up in prison, you're going to have to get some new priorities and probably some new friends, too. Look, you're not getting any younger. You need to get an education so you can get a good job.
Like you just like everybody else. You think you see, but you don't see. You see what you want to see.
I see what's in this folder. It shows me what you've been doing.
I ain't doing nothing.
I am not doing anything. Stop!
I ain't doing nothing.
I'm not doing anything. And yes, you were. Get to the timeout chair. Now, please. I'm sorry. I am so sorry.
All right, so that was always that's a tough one to watch, but I think that plays out in so many settings in so many different ways. And I think it's a great example of all the things in there, right? Implicit bias, micro and macro aggressions, and you see it from a couple of different contexts, and you see it throughout. How it impacts a child and a person throughout the trajectory of his life, right? And we're just seeing him as a young adult, but we're seeing all of the macro aggressions, covert and overt racism, all those things that impacted from the very beginning in different settings, in a playground, in play school, with different adults, and how he's viewed, right? And then we look at the clinician, looks like a school social worker or someone of, from that background, and her implicit bias when she's just even talking to him, and some of the language that she's using that we know happens daily, right, to folks. So it's understanding that. I don't know if anyone has any, wants to share anything on that. I think I see a couple of comments. I see them. So I'll pause here for a minute. Okay, someone said very powerful video. Can we get a link for that video clip? Absolutely, yeah. It is so, yeah, I love to show videos because I think it contextualizes all the didactic language in the discussion that we're talking about, and it makes it really real and succinct. And this is the thing about a therapeutic setting. Those lived experiences are important for people to be able to begin to heal. And as the providers, we cannot be the ones that are causing more harm in the process, right? And in that instance, I love that the clinician has an aha moment where she realizes, like when she's correcting his language, and it takes her back to a memory. of when it was done before, and like the marginalization, the unseen, when he says, you don't see me, right? All of that language. The doctor, right? His automatic assumption that the child must be abused, must be being abused until he sees, oh, he's from a loving family, two-parent family, right? I don't know what else came up for folks as they watched that.
Hi, Zina. This is Trina, and I did share that the video was very powerful, but the part that kind of grabbed at me is being a therapist, and I raised 3 young children to adulthood. I was that advocate when something like that was happening, that I could step in and I could help the person at that moment recognize that there was a bias that they were acting on. And I go back and I think back to, what if I wasn't there at those moments? And that's what I'm looking at in that little boy's eyes, is that there wasn't anyone there at the moment in that instance. And it just happens way too much.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Trina. And again, what you're talking about is like representation within organizational settings and a culture that has adequate supervision, that can adequately have things in place to recognize this, to have supervision around this. Like, we get clinical supervision, but do we have clinical supervision when we need to address implicit bias and things that are happening? I don't think we're taking intentional steps to do that. So when I work particularly with organizations, that's something I often discuss. Well, what happens in your clinical supervision settings? Who's providing clinical supervision? And what is the context of the clinical supervision? Are you thinking about the cultural implications of it? So very important point, Trina, because if you weren't there during those settings, in the setting that you were working in, a child would have not received the appropriate care or he would have been further harmed because of the type of delivery of care. And it's not that a clinician is trying to be bad, or it's that they don't know, they don't understand. So it's building this culture of informing.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so, what I've outlined here is this is an older study from 2007 that kind of describes what we kind of saw visualized in the clip that I showed, and what happens. And color blind statements are often what most people talk about, and it's what I shared anecdotally about what I experienced, right? Like my counselor was colorblind. She really wanted to be. She didn't, but it was harmful for me, right, in that setting. So which is why I needed to seek something else. So we need to be aware of this. So I'm glad folks experienced that video, because I think it adequately helps wrap all of that theory around implicit bias and microaggressions into something real. So it's like when bias happens, what do we do? And there's the pause strategy. It happens for every single one of us in different contexts and different settings. What do we need to do? What's happening? What do we need to pay attention about ourselves and the judgments and assessments we're making? Our actions and reactions to things. What do we need to acknowledge about that? What do we need to understand? What do we need to do so that it doesn't happen again? So Trina intervened in her case, but now maybe from an organizational standpoint, there needs to be something that's formalized, right? Something happened in that interaction that she was aware of. Did she have the support to go to the supervision or to the leadership and say, this is something that's showing up in our environment. We need to find a solution for, and then executing a plan to do better, right? And part of that, and that's something we do as individuals, and something that we need to embed into our organizational settings is kind of this pause strategy, so we can mitigate that. I think when we're working directly with culture, this is from the Culture SAMHSA competency tip book, which I think is a really valuable tool. I think some of you who work with family systems or family systems trained, some of this comes into play. You'll recognize some of this, but it's having a culturogram. It's like a genogram specific to the cultural pieces. And what do we need to know? This is how we can comfortably, when we're uncomfortable asking what we may feel are invasive questions, but comfortably asking from a clinical framework, questions that are specifically related to the person's culture. And what we're striving for here is not to find negative attributes. What we're really pulling for is the strengths from the family, from their community, from their value systems. And this is where our own biases can sometimes come into play and interfere. So you want to really be able to do this with understanding and helping build relationship with your client that goes beyond whatever biases you may be holding. The diversity wheel, is just more direct questions that represent what you're trying to get from a client so that you can create an adequate, treatment plan. What you want to be able to do is these bullet point items. I think some of them are pretty obvious. We don't want to, there's stereotypes and there's ways that we sometimes generalize and make assumptions, but we don't want to lean into those. We want to be able to have a broader context of how we look at people beyond what we see, beyond how maybe they identify. For a long time, I only identified as a Latina, but that was because my family was very racist. The context of my Hispanic household was extremely racist. The fact that my mother had a child with a Black man was a huge controversy in my family. So I grew up with that shame and guilt. And so you have to understand that sometimes there's layers that our clients are dealing with, and getting comfortable with broadening, how do they identify, and what they may be still holding in shame that they're not bringing to the therapeutic setting. Understanding that there's culture within culture. We talked some about that already. Everyone has a unique history, every one of us, right? And understanding that is what's critical, and bringing that out in a therapeutic relationship. And I know sometimes that's not easy. We have in some settings, you're with clients for a very short amount of time, but it's at least gleaning enough information that in the time that you're with those, you really understand, especially when you're working with clients from other cultures, you've done quite a bit of homework that if you're working with clients in short periods of time, that you know enough about them to be able to treat them adequately, or enough of context about their situation, right? Yeah, I think that is obvious. There's some great language is important. These are tools. This is what's great about the hopeful part that I have in the time that we're in, as in our world and our behavioral healthcare setting. Organizations are coming out with tools that we need. And the APA, I think they released this tool, I want to say late last year, but inclusive language guidelines. So this is a tool that's available for you. You just need to Google guidelines, just terminology that's appropriate to use. This is always evolving. So it's gaining your own racial literacy and doing your homework. So you can get uncomfortable with conversations, explore your uncomfortableness, and have courageous conversations. But having some foundation in language and racial literacy is critical for that, right? And how do you have courageous conversations? I think you engage with folks that are different from you, you're open, you sustain your conversation by asking thoughtful questions. I want to know about you. It's a relationship, right? Our clients with a staff member, a friend, a colleague. A courageous conversation is, I want to get to know more about you. That's the context of it, and take away the fear that you may have because you're coming in with your own stuff wound up, right? Deepen your understanding of your own positionality, right? What you hold and what you believe. Understand that, and understand it in the context of others and how they may perceiving it. There's tons and tons and tons of literature available out there. And I'll share with you some books and a few that I have on my desk that I've been using with some clients. The 4 agreements, of a courageous conversation is to stay engaged. It's uncomfortable, experience the discomfort. If you're talking with someone who may have an opposing view, happens all the time now, right? Speak your truth. And here's the most critical thing: expect and accept non-closure, right? Sometimes these things, this is just not easily going to be resolved. We're not going to come to a kumbaya moment. And it's being able to understand and accept that in a clinic. And this is like with staff, colleagues, friends, neighbors. I like to include this. And then with clients, it's understanding that from their context, right? they may be experiencing this, and it's teaching them how to utilize these skills in their world. Understanding that racial trauma is really a significant issue. We are seeing it consistently, day to day, videos, killings, murders. We don't want to teach about Black history. We're not going to call Texas is trying to pass a bill. This is kind of like the vicarious trauma that's experienced that says it was involuntary servitude or work. I kept forgetting the phrase because I don't want to remember it, instead of calling slavery, right? Now it's like, no, they were just, involuntary relocated. That's an actual bill that's in process of, they're trying to pass in the legislature. So when people hear this thing, it's a form of trauma. So it's understanding that our clients are experiencing this, but what we want to help them do is have coping strategies around it. So the first thing we want to do is acknowledge their experience, acknowledge that they're actually going through this. They're not making it up. They're feeling this, right? Have open discussions. Let them give them the opportunity to discuss it. Tell them ways they could seek support beyond the therapeutic setting. What are some things that they can do? Some self-care things, some communal care, some empowerment through resistance, right? Take action, be part of the change. But then in that, what I have found too with working with folks is that there is racial battle fatigue. That is a real thing. And folks experience, because they've been on the front lines, especially these last few years, that they're tired, they're exhausted, they're tired of fighting. So it's being able to acknowledge that and support that in clinical settings, understand that people's mental energy is drained, right? I think for many of us, and I always talk about therapeutic setting, but I also personalize this. We're those people too, right? We're feeling that too. So it's acknowledging that. I, love Resmaa Menachem work. I don't know if anyone has read any of it. I'm a real proponent of somatic therapy because I feel everything that is in our minds, the body definitely keeps the score, and being able to release in tactile and somatic fashions is really helpful for clients. This book is really a beautiful book that has wonderful tools. It talks about the history that we're going through. And I don't know if some of you have read it, but I highly encourage it. It also has activities you can do to help process your own feelings, whether you are a white person, a person of color, it doesn't matter. There's something for everyone in this book. And if you go to his website, he does all kinds of things. I've just recently done his somatic abolition training. It was wonderful. It was cathartic. It was a beautiful space to be in with other individuals. So just, he's kind of like high on my list of folks that I really love. I'll just pause here just a second because I think I see one chat comment. Does anyone have anything? Someone said, I think to the video, I was having emotional reactions to the way that the counselor, doctor, and mother in the park were all acting. Yes, so like this kind of segues well into my grandmother's hands and that racialized trauma. That's trauma you're experiencing, right? That's trauma we're all experiencing. And my intent wasn't for you to and I hope you take some time to take care of yourself after this session. But it is to show that when we see things, we re-experience it again. That vicarious trauma is real, that cultural context, the DSM has a new label for the cultural part of trauma. I have some, my own professional disagreements around it, but what I do appreciate is that at least it's being acknowledged, right? That real trauma piece. And like I said, there's lots of tools that are out there now. This is just some of them. These are some newer ones that I've just been bringing in. This is the Healing Otherness Handbook, How to Overcome the Trauma of Identity-Based Bullying, Empower in Your Difference. So I'll add that to this list before I send out the PowerPoint. But I'm bringing this up because there's tons and tons and tons and tons, and I have stacks of books. This is a really great one, the Racial Healing Handbook. And these are tools that you can use for yourself, and you can also bring into with clients. Like there's different activities you could do. So if you're uncomfortable just with the verbal piece of engaging with clients, get one of these handbooks that has activities that you can do together with your clients. You could do it, for yourself. So tons and tons of available literature out there. So I wanted to just segue a little bit. We mentioned it about organizations. I work primarily with organizations. I do some individual work, but I primarily work with organizations, and it's really about bringing true DE, whatever labels we want to call it, DEIB work, health equity work, diversity work into their organizations. But the whole point is to get organizations to stop treating it as a check the box initiative, that we are truly embedding this into part of the culture. Just like we say with our clients, we want to work ourselves out of a job. We hope we give enough tools to the clients that then they can go on and actualize what they need to. That is my hope with DEIB work. And I hope that there's some point in our time in our world where it's not even needed, because it's just embedded into the culture of organizations, right? So we're not just checking off the box. We do it because, we want accreditations from different accrediting bodies. If you're a clinician, you have to do, every 2 years, whatever your licensure requirement is, you have to do some type of check the box cultural competency. What we want to be able to do is really embed it into our organization, into our individual thinking. So how do you do that? What does that look like? You need to do it on a staff level, needs to be done on a service delivery level, but that goes beyond just your primary care providers who's having the one-to-one interaction. It should even go into the people, the policies and procedures, your admission staff, your accounting staff, your HR staff. All of this should be embedded of it. And how do we do a lot of this? And how do we serve our communities well, or diverse communities well, is you really need to have an awareness, a relationship with stakeholders in your community to help them inform and shape some of that. I firmly believe that this work begins with leadership. What I have seen happen, especially post the George Floyd and the social movement, organizations jumped in, put out a statement. Committees have been formed and mostly driven by line staff, but really not driven. Lots of committees are being formed, but there's no real meat and strategy behind it because we don't have leadership buy-in, not at least in our behavioral health landscape world. I haven't seen that on a consistent basis. So I really believe it starts with the leadership, and all of these things need to be understood. And when I'm working with organizations, my first opening module and workshop that I do with them is really about exploring the why. Why are you doing this? And on an interpersonal level, as leaders, why are you doing this? Because if there are some challenges of the why, and it happens very often in organizations, well, we really don't need to put something formal in place around this. Why don't you? Why is it not important to you when another leader may feel that it's very important to them? So then it's about interpreting and bridging where those differences are, and trying to align what the goals of the organization are that align their mission and value align with any type of DEIB initiative that they want to do. Because ultimately, what is this about? It's creating belonging. You want a place, an organization, a provider service where people feel they belong, your staff and your clients, they feel welcomed, right? I'm gonna pause just a second because I think I see some. I just wanted to explain, currently hypersensitive things. Okay, yeah, I appreciate that, that comment for sure. And, what I often do when I'm working with organizations is I'll often, when there are some segues in people struggling with some of the context of what we're doing, I will work one-on-one with clients. So what I often offer to folks that this is big, this is heavy. If you read My Grandmother's Hands, you'll understand this. This is weighted. All this conversation has a charge to it. There's energy behind it. Is do your own individual work around it, and seek support for it. It is okay to do that. It is it's actually imperative that you do that. So that we're not just hiding behind things and not having our own feelings and emotions that may be conflicting adequately expressed, and that we all feel supported in ways that are impactful for us and need to happen so that there's healing, right? So, okay, I think I said enough there about leadership. The hardwiring piece, here's where, I think we move away from the performative. Are you putting resources behind us? Is your organization actually, beyond having a committee, beyond rolling out some initiatives, are you providing adequate resources to support the mission of a DEIB within your workspaces, within your communities or any organization you're involved in? Are there established commitments and expectations? Is there a strategy? Are you creating a strategy beyond this? Are you regularly attending to it, just like you would any initiative that rolls out in the company, that it's just not, yeah, maybe we meet, from time to time, but there's nothing formal in place, because then it's performative, right? Conducting an organizational self-assessment, there are tons of tools out there available. I recently co-wrote one for the National Association of Treatment Providers that is specific to substance abuse, the substance abuse treatment world. So we have a general assessment tool that is specific. The language that's written is geared towards those that work in substance abuse treatment. So because there were so many tools available, we felt that there wasn't a tool that was reflective of more of the substance abuse space and kind of the nuances within our world, that we created this tool. So if you go on their website, you can find one. You can find, and anyone could do it. It's open. It is a membership organization, but that particular portal, that assessment tool, is available to everyone. And there's also a PDF copy that's available that you could just download, copy as needed. There's no licensing required. We really wanted just organizations that dealt with substance abuse to have it as a tool. So like I mentioned, it's like creating, make sure you have a stack of stakeholders that are just not the business people in the room, that you have people representative from the community, that if you are a service line care delivery organization, that you have some of your alumni involved, alumni that are representative of the communities you serve, because who's seated at the table matters. We heard that from Trina, we heard that from Chad, you've heard that from me. People from marginalized communities, from different communities of lived experiences, can inform treatment in a way that is appropriate and culturally responsive for our communities. So it is imperative that we have seats at the table. So, if you look internally at your own, and this may differ depending on, what segment of work you're in, but I'll tell you, I worked primarily for many years in the private for-profit landscape. I very rarely saw representation of color on leadership. I very rarely saw it represented in marketing and outreach staff, clinical and admissions team. Where you saw a lot of representation were in support staff. So if that's happening within your organization, have an adequate discussion about it. What needs to happen so that you can create diversity? Do you need to create pathways of professional development for folks within your organizations that would benefit from it, that may want it, but are being overlooked, right? Do you reach out to organizations and associations? Because what we really don't want to do is have diversity that's just token gestures, but diversity that's really creating equity and creating spaces at the table where people have a voice and are being heard, right? So I talked a little bit about HR type initiatives. I think that there's such a conversation about the lack of employees available, the lack of clinicians available. I know of color, I'm part of a cohort of so many clinicians of color. Are you looking for them? Are you being intentional in your job searches about diversifying your employer base, right? So it's like reaching out to educational institutions, could be HBCUs. Do you have a relationship with an HBCU that has a social work program, that has a psychology program? Are you creating tracks for folks to be able, and professional development alliances with them, which then will expand, right, the diversity of your teams? Develop internal blind hiring processes so we can mitigate implicit biases in the hiring phase. Talk a little bit, I'm gonna pause for a minute before I go into this and make sure. I think I saw a question. Yeah, thank you, Gwen. Pop that in there. Fantastic. Yeah, it's a really great tool. All right, so websites. Trina, do you have your hand raised or do I have my cursor on you? I just have my cursor on you. Sorry, I thought you had your hand raised. So auditing and branding, what is this about? So are your websites welcoming to diverse communities? Who's represented on them, right? Who's represented in your company's social media when you're putting out information? Are you being, like, this is the BIPOC Mental Health Month. Are you putting out information for diverse communities around mental health and substance abuse disorder during times where it's a great opportunity to? Are you providing resources? What do your printed materials look like? What is represented? And the internal and external is really about the environment of care. And in that tool that was just shared, we have a whole section about the environment of care piece. So when I come in as a marginalized member for any community, do I see myself represented? Are the paintings in the walls culturally reflective of different groups, right? So it's being really mindful about our environment of care, like not just the literature we have out, but the actual, what does it look like in here? You know, how does it feel to other folks when they come in? Business development and community outreach I talked about. And I think the important part about this and building relationships and stakeholders when you're doing outreach to communities is trust building. And there needs to be a recognition that in some communities, they're just not going to trust certain folks. So you may really have to diversify who you're having do the outreach for certain communities. That is just the way it is, you know, and building relationships. So I talked a little much about this, about celebrating diversity. Do you celebrate diversity, or do you have some honored traditions when different months come around that represent different communities? You know, different months that may encompass the Ramadan celebration. You know, that there was just a recent Hindu celebration. Are you celebrating all of the different intricacies, intersections of your staff, of your clients? I think it's so important. I think when we do that and we celebrate and we learn about different cultures is where we really mitigate this marginalization of folks, and we really create true places of belonging. And when it doesn't feel performative, it's like it's part of the relationship building. You know, it's eating together. It's eating together each other's honored traditions and each other's honored foods and understanding that, right? And I talk a lot about external partners because I think so much of this for organizations is difficult to do with their current landscape of staff. They may represent mostly a homogenous group. That is so important to build relationships with external stakeholders. So I hone in on that a lot because I think those are the folks that really help. The communities will help inform you best of what you need, of what they need, right? And the best way that we can do it. People know what they need. Do we give them the platform to do it because we're the experts? Or do we give people the ability to bring their strengths in? So I'll end with this and I'll open it up to any additional questions or comments. This is one of my favorite quotes. I really believe this. This is what keeps me hopeful in these stressful times that we're in. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And when we're in communal care with each other, when we're in community with each other, like we just have done for this past 90 minutes, is a form of that. This is how we start incremental change, right? So thank you all. I will open it up to any other questions. We have some time left.
Zina, thank you so much for that presentation. And one question actually I had that was more around the cultural competency beginning with leadership. And I know folks and providers, you know, if they're at a facility where maybe for one reason or another, if their leadership may not provide avenues for this type of communication or support, what would be maybe some strategies that you think would help?
Yeah, I think it's important. And like I said, what I was finding is organically, in especially the substance abuse resident treatment world, clinicians of color were going to their leadership and saying, we need to do something. So committees were being formed. I think that's an important strategy. I think we can't play small right now when you're representative of certain communities. I think those of us that are within those organizations have to have a voice, have to be able to speak up to our voice, and create some change that way. I know that with one particular organization I worked with, that is what had happened. And it happened during a town hall post the George Floyd movement, when they decided they needed to respond. And a clinician got up and said, I don't know if I'd send a family or friend here, even though I'm a clinician here. And it opened up that bravery, that ability to show up very brave and courageous, really was a catalyst for change within that organization. So I say, speak up often.
Thank you.
And if they don't want to hear you, you got to find a new job.
And then I'm curious, for the providers on the call, in your experience, what are some of the other barriers that you may have come across in trying to effectively treat patients who might come from some of the marginalized communities that Zina discussed here? Would love to kind of just get a sense from the providers on some of those items. Feel free to unmute yourself, or you can enter that into the chat if you like.
Yeah, I'll speak to it a little bit from kind of anecdotally. I think folks, and maybe showing up right here in the room right now, is that there's a real fear. And I think people are afraid sometimes of saying the wrong thing when they're working with a client that is different from themselves. I don't want to hurt their feelings. I don't want them to have to comfort me. But I think a large part of that is doing your own work. And I think you have to start having these open dialogues, even if you're a white clinician, get a group together, get 2 or 3 together, read, my grandmother's hands together, talk about what's coming up for you interpersonally, because so much of who we are and what we're going through shows up in our therapeutic settings. So I would say around that, do your own work and find a cohort, a support group to do it with. Because then it is a barrier if you're not, right? And that client is going to feel it, like we saw the young man feel it, right? Misunderstood and not understood.
I know we have a couple of quick minutes left here. Please, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to unmute yourself or include it in the chat. And one additional thought, Zina, that I guess never really thought about is just the data that you showed on therapist demographics. I think it's so insightful and so important in terms of just how someone can relate to you, not only for the reason you're being there from a treatment perspective, but just beyond that, right? Human to human. I think that was such insightful data.
Yeah, I think that data is really important because of what you were speaking to with the barriers. I think you got to acknowledge what's real and out there. We're not going to solve for this. We're not going to have a representative therapist for every client that walks through our door. That's not realistic. And I also don't believe that you have to be a representative of a certain background to be able to adequately treat a client. I think as long as you are intentional about getting informed and developing your therapeutic relationship, understanding your biases, understanding the needs of your clients, like finding, the books, like I said, there's tons of material out there now. As a good clinician, you show up for your client in the way that they need. So that demographic, we need to shift it just for the obvious, but I don't think it should matter as long as clinicians are doing the work to show up for their clients. I don't think that makes them less effective, is my point.
Oh, that's such a great point. Well, not seeing any other questions. So thank you again, Zina, for this incredibly important, thoughtful, and thought-provoking, frankly, presentation. I know as we all strive to help ensure that patients are getting quality treatment for substance use disorder, I think the information that you covered today in the conversation, the data, this demonstrates how important training for diversity, equity, inclusion is. In the context of really understanding patients and their respective backgrounds, where they come from, their experiences, and really making sure that that's part of quality treatment. So really, thank you again for your time and for the presentation here today.
Thank you. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions that you didn't want to share, you can feel free to email me, and we'll connect that way. Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me to the space. Have a great day, everyone. Take care of yourself if you need to. Okay.